everyone. So welcome to this first series of podcasts. We're going to be talking about race, police and the state. And I'm completely honoured to be joined by Dr Adam Elliott-Cooper. Adam Elliott-Cooper is a research associate in sociology at the University of Greenwich. He has previously worked as a researcher in the Department of Philosophy at UCL, as a teaching fellow in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick, and as a research associate in the Department of Geography at King's College London. As well as all of that, Dr Adam Elliott-Cooper sits on the board of the monitoring group as an anti-racist organisation challenging state racism and racial violence. Like, mate, how do you put all that on a Twitter bio?
Oh no, I don't. Easy solution.
Oh my goodness, wow. I'm thrilled to be talking with you today. I think the first time I met you, we were both doing like activist stuff in NUS Black Students campaign?
I think that's probably right, yeah.
Yeah, years ago, probably like
making trouble, yeah.
Making trouble, getting degrees. I mean, you're on your third one now.
I am. Third and final though.
Oh, you sure?
Oh yeah, preach, yeah, I'm done.
All right, cool. And to those of you that don't know who I am, because I didn't actually introduce myself, I'm Diko Blackings. I was a former student at Brookes University, first Black woman to become president of Brookes SU. Whoop, whoop, that was incredible. And I now work as a business manager in domestic violence. Beyond that, I'm involved in my local Labour Party campaign, running to be a council candidate and be one of the first Black women to be a councillor in 2021. And yeah, that's pretty much just me. So without further ado, let's get into some of these questions and help decolonize this curriculum one question at a time, because knowledge is power. So this will be the first question. Okay, so how would you describe structural racism and institutional racism?
Okay, so I think it's important for us to understand that racism and race isn't necessarily about identity or how people feel, or about interpersonal kind of interactions necessarily. Maybe it's useful to think about where racism comes from in order to best describe in detail what structural racism is. So racism emerges, or modern racism as we know it, emerges out of the European colonial expansions of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. So what Europe does is it quote unquote discovers the Americas. It creates trading posts in in South Asia, across the Indian subcontinent. Of course, it engages in the transatlantic slave trade across West Africa and other parts of the African continent. It quote unquote discovers Australia and engages in a colonization project in that part of the planet. And through the extraction of resources, the exploitation of peoples, and the control of massive populations, what's necessary is a new mode of governance, a new system of control, a new way of categorizing people in order to better exploit, control, and enact violence against them. And that mode of governance, that system of control, is race. And what's important, therefore, about racism is that it's fundamentally linked with exploitation, control, and violence. And it's a form of exploitation, control, and violence which comes from the top down, which comes from the state. It can be economic, of course, in terms of exploitation, but it's also, of course, a cultural, a philosophical project as well, which identifies colonized peoples as being morally degenerate, as being intellectually degenerate, as being sexually promiscuous, as inherently violent. All of these different types of things don't simply help to justify the colonization of their lands and the exploitation of their peoples and resources, but it also does something more. It creates a mode of governance, a system of control that can categorize people in different ways and therefore better exploit them, better differentiate between them, and more effectively control and in many cases kill people as well. So when we think about structural violence today, so when we think about structural racism today, I think we have to understand it as a system of control, a manner in which the state, so the government or businesses are able to better exploit certain people, better control certain people, and in many cases end the life and kill specific people as well. Your other question was about institutional racism, and I'll give maybe a slightly more straightforward definition of institutional racism. So institutional racism is when the normal functioning of an institution produces racist outcomes. So maybe it'd be useful to have one or two examples. I'll use an example from the education system. So when you're in year 6, you take your SATs tests, right? Everyone takes their SATs tests in English, maths and science. I think you're graded on different levels. But at the same time in year 6, so the final year of primary school, you also get your teacher assessments, where the teachers assess what level that you think you're at. And a number of studies were done which looked at every single state school in the entire country, and they compared the teacher assessments to the SATs tests. This was useful because the SATs tests are blind marked. So the person marking your SATs test doesn't know what you look like and doesn't know what your ethnicity is or how you're racialized. Whereas of course your teacher does know those things. And what they found was that on average, black students do considerably better in their SATs tests than in their teacher assessments, and white students do better on average in their teacher assessments than in their SATs results. So what does this tell us? What this doesn't tell us is that all teachers are bigots or inherently discriminatory or terrible racist people with holding overtly racist views. What it does tell us is that the normal functioning of the British education system produces racist outcomes. What I think is important here is that the reason the British education system's normal functioning produces racist outcomes isn't because racism has been embedded in the British education system for decades or generations, but because racism has been embedded in the British education system for centuries. Because the British education system hasn't simply been functioning for the British mainland. It's been functioning in its many colonies. Through the categorizations, the exploitation, the violence that I had previously mentioned, the education system has been fundamental to the philosophical and the ideological projects of colonialism and racism as well. And so by understanding that racism is so fundamentally embedded in British education because of its relationship with empire, as well as education here on the British mainland, it becomes incumbent upon us to realise how deeply embedded that racism is, and therefore how normal racism is to the everyday functioning of the education system.
Wow, definitely. There's so much to unpack there, just in terms of that it hasn't been embedded for decades, as we may assume, because most of us have only lived 4 decades. So the idea of understanding that racism has been within the education system for centuries is a very different experience that we haven't perhaps lived through, have perhaps read about, but have to now kind of understand that those underpinnings, we're still experiencing the legacy of that, the hangovers of colonialism, as it were, and I guess the grasp of what is imperialism. So from this podcast, we're going to have students who'll be listening, teachers who, lecturers will probably think, oh, I'm not in a position of power, I don't hold any institutional power, I don't believe that I'm really propping up structural racism. How could you explain to them quite clearly, like, what is racism, even if you don't have a position of, say, institutional power? How would you explain just racism to them, just the term, very simply?
So I guess very simply, I think we should understand racism as a way of categorizing different human beings and putting them into a hierarchy of morality, a hierarchy of intelligence. Maybe that's the and the function, therefore, of racism is to exploit, to control, and sometimes to kill. Maybe that's the most simple definition. But for people who are involved in the university, who might be students or might be lecturers or other staff members, I think it's important for us to remember that the normal functioning of our institutions produces racist outcomes. So the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, are we facilitating the normal functioning of our institution? So what does the normal functioning of our institution look like? It looks like a specific kind of curriculum, which relies upon certain types of testing, certain types of knowledge, the favouring of this idea that Europe is the place where knowledge, Europe in its settler colonies is the place where valid knowledge comes from. So this is the normal functioning of our institutions. One of the other normal functioning of our institutions is to categorise our students, categorising them as migrants or citizens, categorising them as people who could be suspected of terrorism under the Prevent Act, or being undocumented, or being involved in gangs or other forms of violent crime. These are the normal functionings of our institution. The normal functioning of our institution is the fact that we have to pay for an education, and that therefore there should be significant financial and economic barriers between the public and higher education. That's the normal functioning of our university institutions. The normal functioning of our institutions are that people who provide fundamental things that keep the university going, like cleaning or catering, shouldn't be considered as valuable as the staff who provide teaching and academic research, who are equally as important for keeping the university going. This is the normal functioning of our institution, and all of these normal functionings of the institution produce racist outcomes. Right? You can see this when you look at who are on the precarious contracts, who have to do the kind of domestic work that keep the university going, and who are on the academic contracts, who are on the professorial contracts, who are on the secure, highly paid management contracts, and how those staff are better favoured. You can see this. You can see racism through the way in which the university is complicit with the Prevent programme, the Hostile Environment programme, and other initiatives which criminalise racialised students. And of course, you can see it in the manner in which we teach, how the university produces knowledge, whether it be knowledge which is produced through a white curriculum, a curriculum which is Eurocentric, or whether you see it in the mathematical and environmental and other physical sciences, whether it be its relationship with the global arms trade, the pharmaceutical industry, oil companies, or the financial services, and the way in which these industries and multinational corporations reproduce the exploitation, the destruction, and the extraction of resources from the global south.
Wow, definitely. And I'm learning more about this since, I guess, leaving university, in the sense of how we end up with racist outcomes. When I think about a group of architecture students I know from Brookes who've started their own podcast, and they're talking about how actually a lot of the architecture they've learned isn't particularly going to be that helpful for them in building back in Ghana or Libya or whatever their country of heritage is, because a lot of those buildings are based on Western concepts and ideals of aesthetics and building and land, and actually they've had to really re-evaluate their own practice to ensure that they're effective. And that's the normative function that happens when your curriculum is tailored a certain way, when this is seen as this is normative, I guess, for Western ideas of what a great building should be and Western ideas of architecture. And they're having to decolonize that themselves. I mean, and they've spent £9,000 a year. That's quite a lot. That's quite a lot to put yourself through. As a young student, having to go and think, oh, I've actually got to relearn what I was taught, because it's not giving me the outcomes I expect for my life or for my people to be able to build. And I guess it's examples like that happen. I think that's just one example of something that happened, but there's numerous, I guess, in medicine and science, and I'm sure from your own field of geography, you've experienced similar things too.
Oh yes, certainly. I mean, I think it's important for us to remember that just as many of the schools, the education system in terms of schools in this country has had a very long history and a relationship with empire, our universities have as well. Not only have British academic institutions long been providing the intellectual and philosophical justification and basis for colonial expansion, but of course the huge profits, the almost insurmountable profits that were yielded over centuries of colonialism have come to fund and provide the financial foundations for our universities. And they continue to do that, of course, with their relationships with multinational corporations, whether, as I mentioned, in oil or finance or pharmacology or engineering and weapons trading and those types of things. And so therefore, I think if we want to think seriously about anti-racism within our university, we have to acknowledge how the university is implicated in these forms of global racisms and imperialism, and therefore use that as an argument to decolonize the way that we learn that we learn and that knowledge is produced, and the way in which these subjects are taught, as a very minimum first step in attempting to ameliorate the problems and issues that the university is implicated in. And geography, of course, is one of those subjects, whether it be the history of geography, which was used to map many parts of the colonized world and provide the justification for the forms of human geography, which were used to justify the purported inferiority of colonized peoples, or whether it be the ways in which geography today is continually used to extract resources from the peoples of the global south, whether it be at the University of Oxford, where their Geosciences Centre is funded by Shell Oil, or whether it be the GIS mapping programs at other universities, which are used to facilitate the use of drones in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and other parts of the global south as well.
I'd like to really just touch upon when we talk about global racism, and I guess maybe centre and zone in on America right now, the States, not because it's the only place where racism happens at all. We know that imperialism, colonialism took place on majority of the world, but just right now thinking about I guess the Black Lives Matter movement, but really particularly George Floyd, and your thoughts on that, and perhaps your feelings and perceptions of what is happening in America.
So, as many people are aware, George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis earlier this year, and has led to not simply the largest anti-racist protests in American history, but by many accounts, the largest protests in American history, both in terms of the number of people who have taken to the streets and how prolonged these protests have been. And I think that there are a number of reasons why these protests have been so large and such a galvanizing force. I think partly, of course, it's the fact that the footage of George Floyd is harrowing, and I think speaks to a legacy of lynching in the United States, which I think is, of course, unsurprisingly a galvanizing force. But also I think it's the wider political context in which these police killings have emerged, right? The fact that we have a hyper-nationalist, arguably a white nationalist administration in the White House, the fact that there is a global pandemic which the current administration isn't taking seriously enough, both in terms of keeping people safe from the pandemic itself, in terms of COVID-19, but also the effect that it's having on people's lives and their livelihoods, and the lack of support that people have got in terms of being able to pay their rent or their mortgage payments, being able to keep safe at work, being able to access employment benefits, all of these types of things that are necessary during a lockdown scenario. So I think it's been a kind of almost a perfect storm of different political elements, which has led to this recent wave of mass protests in the United States and elsewhere.
Definitely, for sure. And I'd say it's a manifestation of all the different salient pains, I'd say, that are happening that I guess have really been exacerbated, and COVID, I guess, in some respects could have been the catalyst for that, but equally the death of George Floyd is another thing. So it really became the perfect storm that drew a lot of attention to, I mean, deaths in police custody, police brutality, the treatment of Black people all over the States and also globally. So I'd probably like to I know that you've done a lot of activism in this in the past. That's probably how I met you. A lot of the work you were doing was really looking at Black deaths in police custody. A lot of my knowledge of it comes from you, actually. And I hope that people listening and watch that, honestly, take heed and really understand that it's not just an issue that happens within the States, but really has quite an ugly modern history within the UK. And it's something that I learned more about when my pastor spoke about it, actually spoke about the normalcy of in the 70s hearing about Black men just floating in the river. And it probably could have been the police, or it could have just been, it was what it was. And actually reconciling that, but what we're seeing in the States is something that's very present here in the UK. It's just probably less topical for different reasons. But I'd really like to just zone in and ask you just a couple, just to really help people understand about what it is that happens when we talk about deaths in police custody and what that entails. So really it's just an understanding of why do we have situations where we see so much police brutality, particularly against Black people?
So Although Britain often likes to tell itself that it doesn't have a problem with police racism or police violence, it certainly does. On average, since 1991, roughly one person a week has died at the hands of police, prisons or border agencies in Britain, which is considerably high, particularly considering the fact that routinely our police don't carry guns, although of course some police officers do, and we know that disproportionate use of force is used disproportionately against black people in this country as well. But of course brutality and these extreme cases of people dying at the hands of the police, I think should be understood as a continuum of police violence. I think we should understand policing to be a continuum from the fatalities in which people lose their lives, but also the use of incarceration, the use of arrest, the use of stop and search, the use of tasers, the use of spit hoods, the use of detention, but also the use of other things like injunctions that are used against people. So you have things now called criminal behaviour orders or gang injunctions or knife crime injunctions, where an individual or group of individuals haven't committed an offence or broken the law, but police intelligence tells them that they're more likely than not going to be involved in some kind of violent crime or some other kind of crime. And so the police can impose an injunction which can prevent people from seeing friends or family members, going to certain places, attending college, or it's been used to stop people from getting housing through housing associations. People's colleges have been called up and told them to not enrol this person because we've put them on our gangs database. It's used to surveil them, their use of social media. It's used to prevent them from making music or performing music. Lots of different ways in which the police have used these quite new powers to control the lives disproportionately of young black people who haven't committed an offence but have been identified as being involved in a so-called gang or something like that. And so by understanding police power as a continuum from relatively what we might consider mundane things like a stop, all the way up to the extremities of somebody losing their life and everything in between, I think we can gain a better picture of the problems of both police power, police violence and police racism.
Like, definitely. And I guess there's like so many things that people believe that they're unaware of unless you are engaging those communities, you're explaining this, but also actually just listening and paying attention to the news, because most times when we're probably learning about, I guess, black deaths and police brutality, it really is because of groups like UFFC or the families themselves really leading their campaigns for justice. I mean, most times when it has gained traction in the news, like if you look at Sheko Bayo, who died in Scotland, that really was from the family taking action. Or if we look at it really, like Marsha Rigg, it really is the families of those that are deceased that are really doing a lot of the work. How do you think this impedes impunity, like that relationship that isn't necessarily society or the state that's advocating for these people that have lost their lives, that happens to be the friends, the family, the people that happen to be in that community?
I think we should be unsurprised that it's community organisations, families, grassroots movements that are providing the advocacy for ordinary people. The idea that the state or the government can police itself, I think it would be historically naive to think that that could be something which would be effective or possible. We've seen reform after reform, inquiry after inquiry, but very little significantly has changed in a positive direction when we think about police power, police violence, or police racism. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to support groups like the United Family and Friends campaign, which is made up of families of people who have died at the hands of police, prisons, borders, and other state institutions. But also think about the ways in which everyday forms of resistance can challenge policing, whether it be the fact that more people are filming their experiences of stop and search or being pulled over by the police. We're seeing more cases of people who have experienced police brutality or harassment going public by going to the press, or running campaigns themselves. We're seeing more people argue against the imprisonment of migrants and the shutting down of so-called detention centres, which are effectively prisons for people who are undocumented. We're seeing a whole array of different forms of resistance against policing. So whilst we should be unsurprised that our attention is immediately drawn to these extreme cases of brutality in which people lose their lives, I think we should never lose sight of the fact that there is a whole swathe of different forms of violence that people are experiencing at the hands of the police and prison system, and the extreme forms, the fatal forms of brutality, are the logical outcome of a wider system of violence and control from the police and prison system. And I think we have to address all of those forms of violence if we're to address the extremities.
Wow, so succinctly put. Really, you really just encapsulated again what people are grasping from feeds, from Twitter feeds, from Instagram feeds, from wherever they're getting their information. You've just really been able to package that in a way that is understandable to this audience. So I'm so grateful for that response. I mean, that's really going to help me in articulating deaths in police custody, and not just and all the interactions that people have with the police and resulted in deaths, again, from borders and detention centres as well. I'm just wondering, we're in 2020, obviously we're in lockdown, and we're seeing, I guess, the biggest civil rights movement of this generation happening all at once with Black Lives Matter. How would you reimagine the state of police? What do you think the response should be, whether that's in the States or in the UK? What would you expect to see? Or actually, what would you like to see? Not should we expect, because I believe if I asked you for expectations, that won't inspire anyone to go and campaign for change, but what you would demand.
So I think it's important to point out that the summer of this year has seen the largest anti-racist protests in British history. The last time we saw protests anywhere near this size was in 1981, following the Black People's Day of Action, where between 20 and 30,000 people congregated in central London to protest the racist killing of 13 Black teenagers and children in a house fire in New Cross in South London. But we've seen hundreds of thousands taking to the streets, not just in large multicultural cities and towns across the country, but also in small villages in relatively rural areas where there are very few racialised minorities. And so I think this is really an important moment for anti-racism in Britain, which I think encompasses huge parts of the country, and I think is a very welcome change to the rise of nationalism and the far rights that we've seen gaining ground since the referendum results a few years ago. I think one of the most important and radical demands being made by the current Black Lives Matter movement argues that the police and prison system are beyond reform. So in the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen the prison population in Britain almost double. We've got one of the largest prison populations in Western Europe. We've seen the police being given more and more powers, and we have more and more police officers. And there was a slight blip around the period of austerity, but since the 1970s generally, we've had more and more police officers with more and more powers. Tony Blair gave the police created over 300 new criminal offences and provided the police with considerably more powers of surveillance. As I mentioned, the use of tasers, far more armed officers, and so we have far more police officers with firearms. They have the power to impose injunctions like the one that I already mentioned. And this, of course, unsurprisingly, has massively not only been justified through racist means, but has also exacerbated racism as well, right? So the expansion of policing has really been justified through racist ideas, whether it be the need for more surveillance and more firearms of police officers due to the war on terror, or David Cameron's so-called war on gangs, or whether it be surveillance being used to better identify and weed out undocumented migrants as well. So we've had the police merging with the border agency as well. So racism has been really fundamental to the expansion of police and prison power. And so we should be unsurprised that while we've doubled the prison population over the last 30 years, a quarter of the people within Britain's prison population are racialised minorities, and black people in Britain are incarcerated at the same rates as African Americans in the United States. And so despite, as I mentioned, reform after reform, inquiry after inquiry, we haven't seen a significant improvement in public safety or reduction in violence and harm within British society, despite this massive increase in police and prisons. And when we look at our prison population and who we've been filling with our prisons, what we see are not inherently bad, inherently violent people who need to be kept away from our society. We see a massive disproportionate number of people who have experienced domestic violence or child abuse, have experienced trauma or have a history of mental health problems, have experienced school exclusion or have special educational needs which have been overlooked, have experienced unemployment or homelessness or exploitation in the workplace. And so what we see here, and this is something that Andrew Davis often says, is that what the prison system does isn't incarcerate away bad people. It incarcerates away social problems. It incarcerates away illiteracy and unemployment and poor health and trauma and all of the other things that can be dealt with if we have a well-resourced social system, if we have well-resourced communities, if we have a well-resourced public and welfare sector. And so rather than continually expanding the police and prison system, which has had no discernible impact in improving public safety or harm reduction or reduction in violence, what we instead need to do is have a preventative approach to harm and violence within our society. We need to reopen the hundreds of youth centres which have been closed since austerities began, so our most vulnerable young people have access to the kind of support that they need if they've experienced violence or neglect in the home, or if they're at risk of coming into contact with the police on our streets. We need better investments in mental health provision, particularly for our young people, but other vulnerable people as well. We need better services in terms of domestic support for victims of domestic violence, or people who have experienced substance abuse problems as well, so that they don't end up coming into contact with the police and they're ending up in prison. We need secure housing and real jobs and strong unions and better employment within this country as well, which can help stop people from coming into contact with the police and prison system. So it's through this preventive approach which erodes the resources and power of the police and empowers communities, empowers our social and healthcare services, and empowers support to things like housing and employment, that we can live in a safer society that not only doesn't reproduce the power of a violent and racist police and prison system, but can also make lives for everyone, not just black people, safer and harm-free.
And that will always be the aim, really, for anyone that's involved in any sort of social welfare campaigning or anti-racist work, that we want to improve the lives of all people across the board, all spectrum. And it's interesting what you've just been saying, because it's really coming from talking about the role of the police and how that should change, and actually looking at the responsibility of the state to defund the police but fund other aspects where there could be preventative work put in place to mitigate and reduce them, even in a lot of aspects be able to eliminate a lot of inequalities that exist that are probably man-made and are structural. So I guess what I really want to know is, I guess if you've been on Twitter or you've looked at the news recently, there's a lot of talk about the new racial commission that's being set up. What do you hope that it could achieve, and what are your thoughts about the new racial commission that's being put in place?
I have very little faith in the state really, unless it's forced, engaging in a meaningful way in the kind of proposals that I've just outlined. I think it's incumbent upon us as citizens to force the hand of the state to make these kinds of changes. And many of the approaches to alternatives to policing will need to be community-led. They will need to be our own youth workers within our own communities running our own organisations. They will need to be mental health practitioners who want to be community-focused and are connected to communities and better understanding their needs. They will need to be housing officers that want to provide the support that people need, and there will need to be people who work in addiction services who understand addiction as being a public health concern, not a criminal concern. So I think we really need to focus on a bottom-up approach. The top-down approach, which is being proposed by this current government, would be laughable if the stakes weren't so high. The chair of the commission, Tony Sewell, has long said that institutional racism is effectively a fallacy, and the reason that, for instance, there's evidence of the education system failing black boys is because black boys are, according to him, feminized by multiculturalism and other liberal welfarist policies. And so we can see the ways in which this conservative, racist, and patriarchal, as well as patronizing politics is from the very beginning being inserted into these so-called commissions into racial inequality in this country. And I think whilst it's important to criticise them at every inconceivable juncture, I don't think we should put too much time and energy, or indeed faith, into any kind of effective change that they might bring about.
And that's a fair point and a very interesting criticism, in the sense of the narrative around young black boys. It really seems to vacillate between, well, that idea that they are feminized by neoliberalism policies, or that actually they're just racialized into being dangerous and aggressive and needing like a strict, firm hand and an iron fist. It's just this dichotomy of what young black boys are and how the media perpetuates them, and then I guess how they're then in turn treated through all the systems that they have to interact with, including the police. So even just thinking about the police and young black youth, like, what impact do you believe that policing has in schools? Because I'm very aware that there'll be people that are listening to this and watching this thinking, okay, you want to defund the police, you want to put preventative measures, I'm not really sure if I believe in institutionalized racism. Can you help them to understand the impact that policing has within the school system, as a case study, as it were, as something that's undeniable, rather than it just being something that maybe this happens, maybe it doesn't really, I'm not really too sure, just really hitting the nail on the hammer on the head?
Okay, so let's begin. There's a few elements to that question. Let's begin with institutional racism in policing. So I've talked a little bit about the policing of gangs and how the police use injunctions, how the policing of gangs can lead to people being deported or being given considerably very long custodial sentences, and is used to erode people's civil liberties in a myriad of different ways. And so there are gangs databases in London and in Manchester and a number of other cities in this country. And Amnesty International have written quite a good report on this. If people want to look it up, it's called Trapped in the Matrix. It's about the gangs matrix in London, but it applies to other cities in this country as well. And what one of the studies effectively found was that they looked at the gangs databases in Manchester and London, and they asked them to be broken down by ethnicity. And the Greater Manchester Police and London's Metropolitan Police were like, yep, sure, here you go. And then they said, okay, so how do you define a gang member? How do you define who goes onto the gangs database? And they said it's anyone involved in serious youth violence. So this can be anything from less serious offences like common assault to very serious offences like discharging a firearm or attempted murder. And they said, okay, great, can we have everyone that you've identified as being connected to serious youth violence, and have that broken down by ethnicity, please? Yep, sure, here you go. And what they found was that in Manchester, the majority of people in the gangs database were black, and only a minority, about 25%, were white. Yet when it came to serious youth violence, the overwhelming majority of serious youth violence was carried out by white young people, and only a small amount was carried out by black young people. Over in London, the majority of London's gangs database was black or Asian or minority ethnic young people. Only a small percentage were white. But when it came to serious youth violence, it was 50-50, which is roughly proportionate with London's youth population. So what does that tell us? It tells us, firstly, that the criteria that police say they're using for identifying gang members is not the criteria they in fact use. Mm-hmm. Indeed, what it tells us is that race is a far more salient indicator of who will not and who will be identified as a gang member by the police in both London and Manchester. So when we see the police being deployed into our schools, generally to purportedly to reduce levels of violent crime, we should be unsurprised when those same racist assumptions are reproduced on a on a school level, on the interaction that that police officer or those police officers have with children within our schools. This criminalisation of children at a very young age by this policing of gangs by the police. And we should be unsurprised, therefore, that forms of control of our young people, not simply the things we might be familiar with, an arrest if a crime is committed, or a search if they're suspected of carrying a prohibited item, but other things, as I mentioned before, the injunctions which prevent them from making music or other cultural outputs which are said to perpetuate violence. They're stopping them from hanging out with family members or friends who are alleged purportedly a part of the same gang, stopping them from going to certain places or hanging out in certain areas, going to particular colleges. All of these types of things control and police their lives. And so a report recently was published by the Runnymede Trust, written by Dr Remy Joseph Salisbury, which people can check out online, about the use of police in schools in the Greater Manchester area, and it traces not only the fact that it has zero positive impact in improving levels of public safety, but has a massively detrimental impact through the criminalisation, particularly of young black people, but also a massively, as you can imagine, detrimental impact on their ability to learn and actually benefit in any meaningful way from the school system.
Wow, definitely. So I'd like you to just if we could just go back a little bit and talk about two of the examples you gave that perhaps you and I may know and some of the audience may know, but not everyone could perhaps understand, in the sense of, I guess one would probably be, joint enterprise, which is very easy to search and understand, that maybe not everyone knows about. But the second would also be talking about music and the injunctions and what the impact of that, and the fact that there's been times when Black artists have been told they can't make music because it's been deemed as inciting violence. In the sense that there's no poetic license afforded to Black artists in the mastery of their craft in the way that there are for other artists, and that somehow they're propagated into gang culture when it really is just music. Could you please share your thoughts?
Sure. So joint enterprise is a legal doctrine, quite an old legal doctrine, that effectively enables a prosecution to charge a number of people for a crime that one person has purportedly committed. It's got quite a long history. It was used, I think it was the first time it was ever brought about was when, I think in the 1800s, two people were having effectively a chariot race, and they killed, and a person was killed on the road during the race, and both people were found guilty for manslaughter, I believe. But how it's more commonly used today is when a serious incident of violence occurs, and the police often use their gangs database or their intelligence of so-called gang members to say that a number of people are responsible for that individual offence. And so what it leads to is large numbers, often of children or of young people, being given 10, 15 or 20 years in prison for an offence which sometimes they were not even present at the scene of the offence. And so this has been one of the ways in which there has been a huge expansion in our prison population by incarcerating people for huge amounts of time for committing an offence where they were the court either admits that they did not commit the offence themselves, or they were not even present when the offence was committed. And this is done by so-called police intelligence, very often identifying this young person as a member of a gang. And the way they identify them as a member of a gang is often through them being identified in the same photographs or videos on social media, or maybe making music or other cultural outputs with people who were suspected of carrying out the actual offence. And so we can see this is and we should be unsurprised, therefore, that Black and Asian people are hugely disproportionately represented in the numbers of people incarcerated using this joint enterprise doctrine. And the current head of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, was a director of public prosecutions when joint enterprise was in full swing, and he is one of the people responsible for the escalation in the use of joint enterprise, incarcerating vulnerable young people all over this country. The second thing that you mentioned was the criminalisation of Black music, which has a very long and has a very long history, from the criminalisation of carnival and drumming in the British colonies in the Caribbean to the criminalisation of carnival and blues parties and sound system parties, or pirate radio stations and grime raves in this country as well. But where we're seeing it used more commonly today is the criminalisation of rappers, particularly drill artists. So what the police are able to do is effectively they're able to identify young people who haven't committed any kind of offence, but make music which doesn't incite violence. So in order to incite violence, you have to say, I think that Joe Bloggs should have X violent acts committed upon them, or something like that. But they don't do that in any of their music, so the police aren't able to charge them with inciting violence. What they do in their music is they recount violent events that have taken place in the past, or recount violent stories, or use violent imagery within their stories, which is common through all forms of popular culture, whether you turn on dramas on BBC, or whether you go to the theatre to watch an opera, or whether you listen to rock music, or anything like that. But the way the police get around the law is they say that these young people are involved in a gang, and that if there is a violent incident somewhere else in London, even if they're in no way connected, they will use the fact that they're purportedly a part of the same gang to say that the music incited that violence, and therefore their music should be interpreted as inciting violence. So in a number of cases, young people who haven't committed any kind of offence have been given custodial or suspended sentences based on the performance of a particular song or lyric, which the police have encouraged judges or courts to interpret as inciting violence because of a purported gang affiliation, not because they actually do incite violence legally. And so we can see again the ways in which racism plays a really fundamental way in the policing of Black communities and the expansion of police powers that goes beyond what we might consider to be the normal kinds of policing, like arrest, search, imprisonment, these types of things. And they're being used to control aspects of social and cultural life in ways in which I think are quite scary, and that we need to push back on if we want to live in a society that is even remotely free.
Wow. Let's push back. Let's find some other areas we can push back. How else can we push back, particularly if we look at areas of employment, housing, education, the impacts that has on Black people, not just young Black people, but just in general within the UK?
So let's begin with employment, shall we? If we think about, as I mentioned before, if we think about the ways in which people have been organising in the workplace, particularly against racism, one of the ways in which is through the fact that Black people are more likely to be in frontline services, in the National Health Service, working in transport, working in domestic and cleaning services, or working in security services, lots of different forms of frontline vital services, but however they haven't really, many of them haven't been receiving the care and the workers' rights that they require to work safely and to work securely. So there have been strikes in Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in central London, for instance, by the security staff who are on precarious contracts, who aren't brought in-house, who are subcontracted out, and therefore don't have sick pay or proper pension schemes or holiday pay or any of the other rights and privileges that other clinical staff have within the hospital, even though their work at the hospital is just as important and integral to the functioning of the hospital as anybody else's. And so we see the way here in which race and class come together to categorise specific workers as being less valued and more easily exploitable, and therefore can be treated in the ways in which they are. But these workers are unionising. They're coming together in their own separate unions. They're organising strikes. They're demanding change, and they're demanding respect. And I think it's incumbent on us to support. I've been down to these picket lines myself to try to support these strikes. It's incumbent on us to support these strikes, and we're seeing them at our universities as well, where cleaning staff and catering staff, very often are racialised minorities, have also been demanding the very basics of respect and dignity within the places in which they work. And I think the ways in which these jobs are racialised and gendered, of course, with Black and Asian men more likely to be put in security positions, and Black and Asian women more likely to be put in cleaning positions, which I think reflects a long history of empire, which I haven't got time to go into now. I think if we are to make the first steps in challenging this kind of racial capitalism, it's incumbent upon us to build links of solidarity with these workers. And when we see them organising, we see them unionising, we see them going on strike, we have to support them in every way that we possibly can. When we think about housing, one of the ways in which, of course, we're seeing racism in housing being reproduced is through the hostile environment policy. So it's the ways in which landlords and housing associations are being told to police people who are suspected of being undocumented migrants. And how can we possibly raise suspicion of being an undocumented migrant? It's through someone's suspected nationality, whether they have they don't have an English accent, of course, whether they have a darker skin. Right? All of these types of things are used in order to build suspicion against people who are purportedly undocumented. And more often than not, rather than demanding that they show their papers or their passports or anything like that, they simply aren't rented a room, or aren't rented a home, or aren't offered a mortgage, or aren't offered a place as part of a housing association. So there are organisations, I know there's a London Renters Union, and there are other renters unions in other parts of the country which are organising against this kind of discrimination for people renting or trying to buy homes. And I think it's incumbent upon us to support these kinds of campaigns as well. And I guess the final thing that maybe I'll mention is the importance of non-compliance. Right? So our universities are more, and other places of work are being infiltrated by the police and border agencies. Right? So whether it be for try to make it a statutory obligation for universities and other public sector organisations to identify people who look as if they're radicalised, or they're undocumented, or they're involved in gangs and these types of things. And I think it's incumbent upon us to not comply with this type of policing, because it's a fundamentally racist type of criminalisation which we can passively resist as well as actively resist. So by not engaging in these types of encroachments into our public services by the police and border agencies, we can also stand in solidarity with people criminalised by this form of racism.
And that's a note for everyone to please get involved in the unions in your workplace to support. Don't cross the picket line. Honestly, just be involved in the campaigns that are happening at a local level, because just by you turning up, raising awareness, you can make a big difference. And really remembering the solidarity that we should have with one another, and take time to learn and understand other people's experiences of perhaps their oppression. It may not be something that you yourself are experiencing, or perhaps not even being burdened by at all, but understand that there will be many people that within your workplace, that within, maybe you're studying here but you work maybe in the hospital somewhere else, there'll be other people that might not even earn the same as you, or be treated the same way as you, have the same dignity, or even have the same treatment. You might have the same landlord, but actually the way that you're treated is completely different to maybe your housemate from Nigeria. Bear these things in mind. Okay, as we wrap up, I think the most important thing is all of us belong to some sort of community. If you're listening to this, you're part of the Brookes community, and there'll be multiple communities that you belong to. Maybe just if your heritage, your faith group, the area you're brought up, so many different things that we all would count as our communities and places of spaces of belonging. What can be done at community level to hold the police more accountable?
So there are lots of things that people are doing to hold the police to account at community level. I think we should avoid the kind of police-run or police-facilitated consultancy groups. I think they're toothless and create the illusion of progress, an illusion of accountability, an illusion of transparency, which often isn't the case. But there are lots of localized community organisations which aid people, which work with youth groups to run workshops of young people in how to deal with stop and search. There are groups which provide advocacy for people who've experienced harassment, brutality, or other forms of violence and discrimination at the hands of the police. Group organisations, national organisations like the Monitoring Group, where I sit on the board. There are lots of community organisations which campaign against the bringing of more police into schools, such as No More Exclusions and the Northern Police Monitoring Project, which work in the north of England and southern England respectively. So there are lots of different ways in which people are organising against the police, but there are also things that are more almost spontaneous that people are doing. As I mentioned before, we're seeing more people, the experiences of policemen involved, put it on the internet to shame the police, embarrass and to gain coverage and to spark campaigns and galvanise conversations and mobilisations. We're seeing more and more people going to the press or creating their own media outlets to expose the ways in which violence and harassment and race is being perpetuated. In campaigns being as Joint Enterprise Not Guilty Association, where people who have been incarcerated under joint enterprise, as we already mentioned, exposing how the state is criminalising large numbers of people, also humorising those people incarcerated, giving them helping to a platform, letting their voice be heard by people so they can articulate their own story, lead their own struggles. We're seeing people challenging the use of the border agency, where they to raid shops with expect undocumented people of working, or the workplace that they expect them to be earning a wage, places where they're suspected of living and residing. And we're seeing all of these kind of everyday forms of resistance, which I think are equally as important as the larger organisations and significant mobilisations which have sparked these conversations this summer. I think they're all very much connected and equally as important to each other.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Adam. As always, it is a pleasure to catch up with you and just to hear your thoughts and takes on the state police racism. I mean, we could talk about this for hours on end, and you've really given us a lot to think about and to go home with. So really grateful and really honoured that we even got to have this time during COVID. We're all busy people, but I'm so thankful for Brookes for being involved in this and funding this, and that hopefully this will begin to spark changes in your curriculum in the way that you approach race, police, understanding institutional and racial discrimination, and really to be able to think more critically about the Black Lives Matter movement, and also the ways that racism and racial outcomes are happening within your institution and what you can do about it. So thank you so much for that. If you have any closing thoughts, any books, anything you'd like to plug, then please, go for it.
I'm not sure if there's anything I necessarily want to plug, but if people want to read more about policing and Britain, there's a really great book called Stay Here to Fight, which is about the history of anti-racist struggle in this country. It's been published by Pluto Press just last year, and it draws together articles from Black magazine in the 1970s and 80s called Race Today. So Stay Here to Fight is a really brilliant resource if people want to hear about history. And I would encourage people to follow the Monitor Group, which is an organisation that I work with on Twitter or on the forms of social media, to find out about the different national campaigns against racism and state violence, which we're engaged in all over the country, and that they might want to learn about and maybe get involved in.
Wow, thank you for that. I hope that people take note of that, write that down. I'm sure we'll put the notes somewhere so it's accessible for everyone to be able to read and learn. There's never too much you can read. I never feel like you know enough. There's always much more to learn, and the struggle continues. So thank you so much, Dr. Adam Elliott-Cooper, and we wish you all the best in all your endeavours and continue the fight. The long fight.
Thanks so much for having me, Diko. It's been great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Bye. Take care.